The European Union is widening its strategic horizon. Beyond borders, energy security, and critical infrastructure, Brussels now speaks openly about another territory, the information space, not as a metaphor alone, as a named object of policy and institutional attention. On November 12, 2025, the European Commission and the High Representative presented the European Democracy Shield, a package meant to protect democracy from disinformation, information manipulation, foreign interference, hybrid operations, and electoral risks, including those tied to artificial intelligence. At first glance, the aim is difficult to contest. At first glance, the objective is hard to contest. Who would oppose protecting elections, or deny that deepfakes, fake accounts, coordinated disinformation, and influence operations are real problems? A closer reading of the documents tells a more complicated story. This is not one simple law, and not one European agency with a clear address and an easy-to-read mandate. Democracy Shield is not a single law or agency with one address, one director, and one mandate easy to read in public. It is an architecture, a network of EU institutions, national authorities, digital platforms, NGOs, fact-checkers, experts, and technology, all tied to the declared goal of protecting the integrity of Europe's information space. This is the shift the article names explicitly. The modern state once defended borders, infrastructure, public order, markets, energy, and communications. Now, through Democracy Shield, the EU treats the information space itself as strategic territory, to be monitored, administered, and protected by public policy. This is not the blunt censorship of authoritarian regimes. There is no official list of permitted and forbidden opinions. The mechanism is more sophisticated. Coordination, standards, funding, classifications, priority notices, media literacy, fact-checking, pre-bunking, monitoring, and rapid response. That is the modern bureaucratic arsenal, the invention through which power can look like procedure. At the center sit the European Commission and the new European Center for Democratic Resilience, presented as the coordinating structure for anticipating, detecting, and responding to threats, especially external information manipulation and disinformation. On paper, the center is the hub. In practice, it sits inside a much wider network of actors. Official documents say Democracy Shield should strengthen reaction capacity, shore up information space integrity, protect elections, and build societal resilience. Those aims are stated in institutional language. Then the first serious democratic question appears. Who decides what counts as manipulation and what counts as legitimate opinion? In theory, the line looks simple. In practice, it is not. A claim can be wrong, incomplete, partisan, exaggerated, or inconvenient. Not every critique of the EU is Russian propaganda. Not every distrust of institutions is a hybrid operation. Yet the new institutional language keeps public debate toward information security, a frame that can treat legitimate dissent and critical views as potential threats rather than as the noise a democracy is supposed to absorb. A central role in this architecture belongs to the European Digital Media Observatory, EDMO. It is not a simple website for checking claims and not a single newsroom. It is presented as infrastructure. EDMO is European infrastructure, bringing together researchers, fact-checkers, media organizations, experts, and national or regional hubs. Its 15 hubs cover all 27 EU member states, plus Moldova, Norway, and Ukraine, a continental network built to counter disinformation. Romania is not a spectator in this system. The regional component that matters here is BROD, the Bulgarian-Romanian Observatory of Digital Media, described as a regional, multinational, multidisciplinary hub. According to its own presentation, BROD detects, analyzes, and counters disinformation and misinformation in Bulgaria, Romania, and, more recently, Moldova. The project ran 30 months, from December 2022 to May 2025, on a budget of more than 2.6 million euros. BROD's partner list shows this is not marginal work. Sophia University and Gate Institute, the Center for Independent Journalism, the Center for the Study of Democracy, Cometric, AFP, Funky Citizens, Bulgarian National Television, Globsec, SNSPA, and XWiki. For Romania, the names that stand out are SNSPA, Funky Citizens, and Factual, the Center for Independent Journalism, and XWiki. The first point to grasp: Democracy Shield is not an abstract Brussels hovering above national capitals. Romania is already connected to the European ecosystem of monitoring, analysis, and counter-disinformation through hubs, partners, grants, and institutional links on the ground. The second point concerns money. In March 2026, the European Commission announced a €5 million grant to support independent fact-checkers inside the EU and beyond under the Democracy Shield umbrella. The sum is modest in Brussels terms. The signal is not. The stated goals are to consolidate a European fact-checking network, expand verification capacity across all official EU languages, and build a common European verification database. Fact-checking is no longer described only as independent journalism or civic initiative. It is becoming part of an official European infrastructure for protecting democracy. €5 million is not large in EU budget terms, but the political signal matters. When truth verification work is publicly funded, standardized, and folded into institutional machinery, one question becomes hard to avoid: how much independence remains? This is presented as a question, not an accusation. In a healthy democracy, questions about money, power, and influence should not be treated as disinformation simply because they are inconvenient to the institutions that finance the answers. That leads to one of the system's most uncomfortable questions: who verifies the independence of the arbiters? Traditionally, press and civic groups were external watchdogs, monitoring institutions, criticizing authorities, and flagging abuse. The new architecture folds part of that watchdog function into the funded ecosystem itself. In the new European architecture, many organizations involved in verification, media education, or counter-disinformation are funded directly or indirectly through Digital Europe, CRV, Horizon Europe, or dedicated fact-checking grants. That is not illegal, but it raises a structural conflict of interest. Organizations know instinctively who funds their work and who can extend or terminate that funding. The problem is not the good faith of the people involved, it is the design of the system. In a mature democracy, arbiters must be independent and perceived as independent. No overt censor is required for a subtle form of censorship to emerge. Over time, an ecosystem like this can retain mainly those organizations whose conclusions do not challenge the premises of their funders, not necessarily because they were bought, but because those who pressed uncomfortable questions too hard may no longer be among the funded. Another important component within this framework consists of the so-called trusted flaggers. These entities are explicitly provided for in the Digital Services Act. They possess a role distinct from that of traditional fact-checkers. Fact-checkers operate primarily in the realm of true versus false. Trusted flaggers, conversely, operate in the domain of legal versus illegal content. Trusted flaggers identify content they consider potentially illegal and notify platforms, which must treat those notices with priority. That creates a category of actors with privileged access to the moderation systems of major digital platforms. Not ordinary user reports, but notices that carry procedural weight. In Romania, the national authority ANCOM has officially granted trusted flagger status to 4 specific entities: Save the Children Romania, the Elie Wiesel National Institute for Studying the Holocaust in Romania, the eLiberare Association, and the Jesuit Refugee Service Romania. Here, too, the core issue is not that these organizations are acting illegally. Their status is clearly provided for by European regulation and duly granted by the competent national authority. The problem, however, is different. Who, in practical terms, controls the manner in which these flaggers wield this significant power? The short answer, within the classic framework of administrative law, is stark: no one. That is not a technical detail. It is a real gap in digital rule of law, a space where effects on expression are tangible, but classical roots of responsibility are thin. Who is accountable when the system gets it wrong? In the classic rule of law model, an administrative act can be challenged: procedure, reasoning, and a court. In the digital architecture, the lines blur. Content is reported, reach is limited, or an account is suspended. But who made the decision? The trusted flagger, the platform, an algorithm, the DSA coordinator? None of them holds classic public authority, yet the effect on expression can be immediate. None of these actors formally exercises classic public power. The result is a gray zone, where effects on freedom of expression can be real, while traditional accountability and judicial review become harder to use. Power does not disappear. It is redistributed among private and semi-public actors. The entire architecture of Democracy Shield begins with an apparently simple premise: disinformation must be identified and combated. Yet this very premise conceals one of the most difficult foundational questions of the entire system: who precisely defines disinformation? For child pornography, terrorism, or fraud, legal criteria are relatively clear. For disinformation, they are not. Many contested statements are neither fully true nor fully false. Selective facts, debatable interpretations, or political opinions. History offers numerous stark examples. Information initially labeled as disinformation or a conspiracy theory later proved to be partially or entirely confirmed. Conversely, assertions promoted with absolute certainty by institutions and experts were subsequently proven wrong. No arbiter, however well-intentioned, possesses privileged access to tomorrow's truth. The problem is not that experts make mistakes. Every human can err. The problem arises when institutional infrastructure begins to exercise epistemic authority, the power to decide which version of reality is credible enough to promote and which is problematic enough to limit. The more concentrated that authority becomes, the harder the democratic question bites. If arbiters decide what is truth and what is disinformation, who verifies the arbiters? Shaping moderation priorities on large platforms is not a side issue. In the social media era, visibility can fall without a formal ban. Harder to find, less distributed, less recommended, easier to flag. That is how informational control often works under algorithms, not with boots on the ground, but with terms, rankings, and distribution rules. Another concept in the package is pre-bunking. Classic fact-checking tests a claim after it appears. Pre-bunking tries to anticipate a narrative and prepare a response before it spreads. The timeline is the difference, and so is the authority implied. Here lies perhaps the most sensitive conceptual problem. Pre-bunking intervenes before public debate fully happens, before arguments are fully made, before the public has heard them. Supporters compare it to a cognitive vaccine against manipulation. Critics note it assumes an authority that decides in advance which narratives are problematic enough to require preventive intervention. Fact-checking tests a statement already made against facts, with room to challenge the conclusion. Pre-bunking pre-classifies a position before it exists in public space, judging how legitimate an idea may be before anyone has spoken it. Here lies the risk of confusing anti-manipulation work with shaping public debate itself. The earlier the intervention in the information cycle, the harder it is to say where protection against disinformation ends and influence over how citizens form opinions begins. Broad uses the concept explicitly. In a Bulgaria report published in early 2026, it showed that before elections, certain narratives can be anticipated, and that an initial list can serve to disarm them as a pre-bunking instrument. The official explanation can sound reasonable. If a false campaign is about to spread, preparing the public seems logical. The harder question is who decides, before the debate begins, which narratives must be disarmed, and on what criteria. Between a demonstrably false campaign and an inconvenient political opinion, there is, in practice, a gray zone. Institutions tend to read criticism as risk, not democratic feedback. Bureaucracy has procedures, not a sense of humor, and not an instinct for liberty. The infrastructure also includes technology partners such as Cometric, media monitoring, advanced algorithms, real-time tracking, sentiment analysis, and trend detection. Broad names these tools openly. The democratic question is who sees the output and what happens next. That shifts the discussion again, from journalists checking public claims to monitoring flows, automated classification, and trend detection. In technical language, it can sound neutral. In democratic language, the questions are simpler. Who sees these analyses? What is done with them? And how can a wrong label be contested? Supporters are right that the dangers are real. Russia, China, and other actors use information manipulation. Coordinated campaigns, deep fakes, fake accounts, and influence operations exist. Elections and societies can be destabilized. To deny that would be absurd. The existence of a real threat, however, does not justify every mechanism built in its name. To deny those realities would be absurd, but a real threat does not automatically justify every mechanism assembled to fight it, especially when the mechanism is permanent, diffuse, and hard to challenge after the emergency language fades. Here is the distinction Brussels too often avoids. Defending democracy against external manipulation is one thing. Building a permanent infrastructure that may come to administer internal public discourse is another. Critics are already on record. The Jacques Delors Center described Democracy Shield as a catalog of ideas and warned that emphasis on external interference may push other internal democratic problems to the margins. It also points to the wider money picture. The Agora EU proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework reaches €8.6 billion for democratic values, media, culture, and civil society. MCC Brussels, in Norman Lewis's report, goes further. Democracy Shield does not defend democracy, but curates and contains it, reframing internal opposition and dissent as information risk. The language is militant, and the source is openly critical of Brussels. The signal is still worth hearing. When authority over speech is outsourced to NGOs, fact-checkers, and privileged flaggers, the question of who answers to the public does not go away. It only becomes harder to ask. The central question is not whether Democracy Shield is good or bad. It is whether an infrastructure of this kind can exist without, over time, accumulating power over what can be said, seen, and treated as legitimate public speech. The EU says it defends democracy. Perhaps it means to. But democracy is not defended only by fighting falsehoods. It is also defended by the citizens' right to err, suspect, criticize, doubt, and distrust institutions. A democratic society is not a classroom where the Commission keeps the register, NGOs hand out conduct grades, and platforms send the undisciplined to the algorithmic hallway. Democracy is noisy, imperfect, sometimes hysterical, often poorly informed, and difficult to administer. The article insists that is not a defect to be engineered away. It is the condition democracy is meant to survive. Democracy Shield is not a ministry of truth, and the article refuses the easy hyperbole. It is something more subtle, and for that reason more consequential. The start of treating the information space as a politically administered domain through institutions, funding, standards, expert networks, platforms, and technology. When information becomes an administered domain, the question who guards the guardians stops being rhetorical. An institution that builds its own immune system cannot promise it will always tell infection from its own tissue, especially when it also defines what counts as infection. That is the closing question the article leaves on the table.